I made my career out of films because I basically came from a sort of lower theatrical family who were in music hall and who were in the theatre, and I had cousins who were actors and actresses, not very good ones. And so,
Sorry,
yeah, that was, I heard it. Okay.
Okay, stand by everyone. That's one up. That's good. Yours, Graham.
Yeah, just give me the question.
Right, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about your background in feature films and how and why you made this your career.
Yes, I would, I think, give you a bit of an idea of my background. I really came from a family who were connected with, you know, the sort of lower echelons of the theatre. Some of them were carpenters in the theatre, some of them were actors, some of them were actresses, and my cousin. So I had a sort of theatre, you know, I don't know about theatre in my blood, but a sort of background of the theatre. And of course, also musicians too. My father was a very well-known organist, and at one time did indeed play for the cinema on the piano in the local cinema. So I had all that as an early influence, I guess. And an uncle of mine, my mother's cousin actually, was a cameraman with MGM in Hollywood, and in 1938 he came across to London because, you know, the clouds of war were gathering and his family were living in Denmark at the time, and he wanted to see them, and then the clouds of war got darker, and this is an appropriate time for all that, isn't it? Because this is the 50th anniversary. Anyway, he came over, and of course the war broke out, things got worse. So he stayed here and formed a documentary company and started to make not really documentaries, instructional films about medical things and what to do in an air raid and what to do with the gas and all those sort of things, which he did for the Ministry of Information. So although I was still at school, every holiday I got, I used to traipse around with him and try and learn more about the film business. And so from that, when I eventually went into the film business, I went in as a clapper loader and worked on the floor. It was Alexander Korda who really gave me the idea to move into the cutting rooms, because he told me that, in fact, the best place to learn to be a director was in the cutting room. So I got myself a job in the cutting room as a sort of boy, a coffee lad, a can carrier, and then worked my way up from there. Was that all right?
Yeah, I think that is actually. It's quite.
Want me to say anything more?
That's quite nice intro. We've got you into the editing room, haven't we?
Yes.
So, right.
Mm.
You're credited with developing the definitive editing style for a Bond film.
Mm.
What influence did the novels have in your final choice of style, if at all?
Yes, they did, because they were extremely good paperbacks.
So
And
can we say about can we start off with saying?
oh, of course we can. Of course we can. Yes, the style of editing that I created for Dr. No was really because I was forced, because of the shooting of Dr. No. We had very poor weather, we had no money, it was a very cheap type of film. And there were a number of holes, there were a number of areas that weren't covered and weren't shot. So it took a great deal of ingenuity. And Terence, fortunately, Terence Young, who had been, I had known since he made They Were Not Divided, was very worried about all this, quite naturally, because it wasn't really his fault. So I managed to get the opportunity to experiment and do things. And I thought to myself that these are paperback films. These are lovely, lovely stories that you read, people read going up and down the train to work and enjoying and imagining that they are, in fact, James Bond. And so it's a paperback, and that's how the film should be. The film should be paperback films. In those days, you have to remember, we're talking too about the beginning of the 60s. Filmmaking was quite different. Everybody does it now. They jump you around all over the place and you follow it, because we're much more sophisticated, we're visual talking and education is concerned. But in those days they didn't. So what I did, and what was innovative of the whole thing, was I virtually did what, of course, they do a great deal today. I jumped from one thing to the other. I never waited for to go through the door or come down the path or get down the stairs or anything like that. In fact, we didn't have those shots. They had not been shot, and there were a number of holes because of bad weather in the Jamaican location that hadn't been done. So the process came out of an amount of thinking of saying, well, the films ought to be paperback films. Now, how do we go about that? And the necessity to make it all work. And funnily enough, it worked very well. And we were able also, if anybody analyzes Dr. No, you'll see that I utilized the music, the John Barry score, in a humorous way, always having the James Bond theme coming up before, in fact, he went onto a mission or did something dangerous or shot somebody. And the audience began to enjoy that. And it was an entirely different film from what people had been looking at in that time. And consequently, it was the beginning of the 60s. People wanted something new. It was a lovely idea and way that Fleming happened to have had of putting his hero in well-cut Savile Row suits and describing them, and wonderful Turnbull and Asser shirts, cotton madras, and the right ties, and all the right manners, and background which Fleming had and had been educated to. And that was, I think, the reason why, Bonds have become so extraordinary in their influence on everybody.
All right, lovely.
All right?
That's a good thing to understand.
Was that good thinking?
Yeah.
Came out of the top of my head. Oh, I mustn't say that.
Yeah, good.
Well, did you not have a question there about Ian Fleming?
Yeah.
What did you have there? What did I think?
Well, there's one here. Were you familiar with Fleming's novels about James Bond?
Yes, that's quite an interesting. I'd like to tell you that. Yes, I was familiar with. Well, I wasn't familiar with all the ones that had been written by the time we did Dr. No. When I was, I edited a film. I was the editor of a big rank film called, in those days, called Ferry to Hong Kong with Orson Welles and Kurt Jurgens. And we went out to Hong Kong to shoot it and to edit it and to do as much of it as we could on the spot there. And whilst I was there, I had an assistant who said to me one day, "Have you read this James Bond novel?" And apparently he had just read Casino Royale. And I said, "No, I haven't. What is this?" "Oh," he said, "you must read it. You must read it. It's great stuff." And so he gave me the book to read, and I read it, and I thought, it's quite good. TV was coming along at that time, and that was what I really thought about it. And so when the opportunity, I was working on other films, and I was doing Sink the Bismarck, I think, or, no, I wasn't. I was doing On the Fiddle at Shepperton when Dr. No came up, and with Sean, funnily enough, which is another story. And consequently, when Harry called on me, I was aware of the Bond novels. And by then, I think there were 4 of them. I think the first 4 had come out by the time we started. Certainly Thunderball had come out. And so that was my involvement with Fleming, and that was how I got to read them in the first place.
The fact that you were shooting On the Fiddle with Sean Connery and Alfred Lynch.
Yes, there is a connection. There is indeed a connection, because we were making, with Ben Fish, I was editing a film called On the Fiddle in this country, and in America I think it's called Operation Snafu. And so somehow or other I was having dinner one night with Ben Fish, who was the producer of On the Fiddle, Operation Snafu, in the Polish club, because he was originally Polish. And who should come into the Polish club but Harry and his wife and one thing and another. And it was all very jolly and nice, and they joined us. And during the time of the conversation, Harry was talking about, he finally got things together, and he was going to make a film of James Bond, and they were probably going to do Dr. No or Thunderball, I think, at that time. But anyway, they were going to do one of the films. And they were looking desperately for a James Bond character. And during the course of the discussion and what have you, Sean Connery's name came up, and Ben Fish said, well, we've just done this film with him, you know. Peter, what do you think? And I said, well, I think it'd be great. Why not? If you like, I'll send up a reel of the stuff that we've got. Of course, it's a very different character, and we explained all that. And in fact, the film was really made to promote a wonderful little actor called Alfie Lynch, which, of course, after the successes of the James Bond films, seemed to have promoted just, again, Sean Connery. But that's how it came about. And I sent up a reel for Harry to look at. How much influence that had on the actual choosing of him, I don't know. But I was delighted when he got the part. I thought he would be very good in the part. I thought, perfect choice for me.
Well, that's good, actually. Yeah. As I can imagine,
Good?
Yeah, I can imagine that would have had an influence, though, because I'm thinking about the sequences when he's running about with a machine gun, which was pretty good. Right.
Okay. We're still running, still using up tape. Are we using up tape?
Yeah.
Oh, that's easy. That's cheap.
Right, next question. What was your relationship with Terence Young? Tell us about how well you worked together.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Terence Young was one of the early film directors I met as a visitor to the studios when I used to go down there with my uncle. And I always watched him as a visitor, as a boy, I was. And he was, I think, working on Dangerous Moonlight or something of that sort. And I suppose just casually got to know him. And then eventually I worked with him in the 50s. When I was in the cutting room, because I was an assistant to his editor, the editor that he always used. So I worked with him on a film called Tall Headlines, which was made at Walton-on-Stem studio in those days, wouldn't you believe? And we became very good friends. And I liked him. I had a great admiration for him. And I thought he was extremely intelligent and had great taste. And I really thought he was a very good director. I think he was a much greater director than a lot of people gave him credit for. And he made some marvelous films. And so there was a continuing sort of, just general friendship with him, that was all. So when we came to do Dr. No, I hadn't worked with him for some time. I was delighted. I was pleased to do it, because it was going to be Terence, whom I knew. And of course, in the course of then onwards, the 60s, worked with him a lot. and we became greater friends. And I was even more in admiration of him, I must say. I think he did a great deal of work. And he encouraged me enormously. When things were not quite right or didn't go well, which happens on every film, he would encourage me to do anything outrageously or whatever, because he'd always say, well, we can always put it back. Do it, my boy, do it, my boy. I used to say, okay, fine, but it might not work. And he used to say, doesn't matter. And would encourage me enormously. And then when I did it, and it did work, because I generally made sure that it did, he would be very praising about the whole thing and say, oh, that's great, that's terrific, Which indeed he did with Dr. No, and the editing thing of that, when I started to move it along so fast and push it. More, he said, do it more, that's great. So my relationship was enjoyable. And he was a man of enormous generosity and kindness and enormous personality, I felt. Also, I felt he had great taste and was an ideal director for James Bond. He was very similar to Ian Fleming himself, because, although I only met Fleming once, I believe that he wrote James Bond stories about himself. That is how he imagined himself to be. And he was, he was a young man of considerable education. He'd been to a good public school, he'd been to Eton, and he'd been to university, and he came from a very established, well-to-do family. And on top of that, he was, I call him a delightful snob. He knew everything, he knew about the best clothes to wear, And he himself always looks chic and smart, or whatever you like to call it. And he knew about the best wines, and he knew what to eat and what not to eat. And he injected those into his character of James Bond. And at the time, of course, I know it was 15 years after the war, as it were, but it worked. The public were ready for something snobbish like this to come along and influence them, especially the younger people. If you look at, you have to realize that this was the 60s, the beginning of the 60s, when this entire new style started. And if you look at the people at those times, the young people were all dressed very well. They were all dressed tastefully. You look at the early pictures of the Beatles. They look marvelous. They're 4 trim characters. And I think that was the time, and it was partly due to Bond, that all this started, that all this style, this new style, among the young people started. And it grew from there. And it seems to have got lost now because the young people have started their own style. Wake up.
Yeah. It's just come on at the end there.
Yes, it did just.
Because that was
Just-
really ideal.
Yeah, yes, that was good. Saying hello to him, and we talked briefly about I think it was to do with the fight From Russia with Love. But I really don't remember. I don't think I better get into that. I did tell her I don't have, other than say. I mean, you could say to me, did you? Yeah, can do.
Okay, so when you met Fleming, what were your impressions of him?
Well, he was when I met Fleming, I met him in the shooting of From Russia with Love, and he was a very elegant man. He was really very... I understood why I thought that, in fact, his character of James Bond was very much patterned after himself, because he was an elegant man, and he was obviously very interested in everything that went on, intelligent. I didn't have very much to say with him. I was just introduced to him, and we talked of pleasantries and what was going on for 5 or 10 minutes, and that was about my meeting with him. He, of course, was not a very healthy man at that time. He'd had, I think, he suffered from a heart problem. And in 1964, I think he died, didn't he? 1964, thereabouts. So I didn't get much opportunity, I'm afraid, to get to know him in any way. He didn't interfere in any of the filming. And if he thought that they were so good that he wrote his own scripts, I didn't know anything about it. I certainly didn't knowingly see a script that was actually written by Fleming. Although, of course, there was all that debacle about the Thunderball script and Dick Whittington and the producer, Chappie, at that time. But other than that, I really didn't have very much information about him. He was not concerned. I mean, I was not concerned with him, in fact, making the films. He didn't interfere in any way. And in fact, I'm not sure when he saw them. I can't remember whether we ever had runnings. We didn't have any special runnings for him at all. He must have seen them after we'd finished them, I think. And as far as I know, he was always very pleased with what he saw.
Did Fleming ever pass any comment about Connery in the role at all?
No, I don't remember him casting any comment about Sean in the role. I think he was quite happy about that. The only person who was not happy about that, if I remember right, was Dilys Powell, the Sunday Times film critic, who didn't think that Sean was the quite type. She didn't really see him as an old Etonian and a naval type. But it doesn't matter, he grew into the part, I must say. And by the time we finished the second one, he was James Bond, there was no doubt about it. And very splendid he was in it, and how splendid he's become since then, I must say. He's a fine actor.
Lovely, thank you. Right. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the first Bond film you directed, is praised as not only a great film, but the closest translation of Ian Fleming's novel. Was this decision in your hands as director, or was this a consensus by the producers and yourself?
Well, you must remember the producers were extremely tasteful chaps, people, nice, and I'd worked with them for a long while by then. And so, as a director, you can't really do anything without at least consulting or talking with your producer, unless you don't like him or something. And I was very fond of both of my producers. They were extraordinarily good characters and wonderful people to work for. There's no doubt about that. But I must say, I was very strong-minded about everything I did on the Majesty Secret Service. I was determined it was going to be a good film, and I wanted it to be a good film. I already had one terrible handicap, in a way, insofar that though it had nothing to do with George Lazenby, but it was the fact that I had to transfer from Sean Connery to another actor, and that was a very big problem. And that was also a very big challenge for me, that I had to make it work for another time, for another actor. And I was very determined in my own mind that this was going to be. So in order to make all that determination come to fruition, I had to be pretty sure about everything I was doing. And I was. I was perhaps unbearably sure at some times, or whatever other word you want to use. But I did make certain that we were going to get a good picture. And we got a good picture, I'm delighted to say. And time has told us that we have a good picture. And I think that George was magnificent in the part and did very, very well for a younger man who had never done acting of that scale before. After all, he was more of a model and had done commercials and such things. I think he represented himself and played the part of James Bond extremely well indeed. And I also think it was Fleming's best novel. So I'm prejudiced in favour of the film, I guess.
Okay, can we cut their cards
Yeah.
going? Yeah, sorry.
Was that all right? Thank you. All right.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a run.
One thing that I wanted to particularly ask from this list of questions, because they're interviewing Hugh Hefner as well. In On Majesty's Secret Service.
Hugh Hefner?
Yeah.
I never met him.
Hefner was a fan of Fleming's. I mean, they published his books before they were released in this country in serialised form. It was a wonderful painting.
Really?
Yeah. But basically,
okay, fine. Yes, with the story, the one thing about the book of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it was a story of emotion, and it was a sincere, I always felt, in the depicting of it.
Can we start
Yes, I
that?
saw it, I heard it. I don't think it mattered. Are we all right?
Okay. Oh, you're going to get traffic noise.
Yes, you're going to get it, I'm afraid. Little of it. Let it go on. I don't
It's not
think.
your problem. This part's very
No,
touching.
it's not.
Yeah, because otherwise we're going to destroy your natural
Yeah,
flow.
exactly.
Actually, and I think
It's
that's
not
probably better.
disturbing.
My
It's
natural.
not disturbing.
It's all atmos.
Your natural flow.
Yeah, okay. So,
Very good.
Yeah, but
Can
we
I
want to be able to
flow?
hear what Peter's saying.
Oh,
you know.
Peter's...
Can I
you've
flow?
got the
Am
phone on.
I loud enough?
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
you're fine.
I am.
I've
Okay.
got to really listen to the background.
Right.
No, just listen to my dulcet tones.
Off you go.
All right, fine. Yeah, with the story of On Her Majesty's Service. So I'll start again. With the book of the story of On Her Majesty's Secret Service that Ian Fleming wrote at that time, I always considered it to be the best of his writing. It's extremely well written, I thought. And also, it has a great emotion about it, because for the first time, James Bond is involved with a female. It has a true emotional relationship, and indeed, of course, in the end gets married. So there must be some sincerity about this whole thing and this whole relationship. And I felt by then, certainly within the films that we'd already done, there was always this sort of, as the Italians call it, Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang about him. And that was fine, but it wasn't as sincere as... And my problem, not a problem, but my desire was to get an emotional type film, a different sort of Bond. One of the reasons why I didn't want the gadgetry in the film, and if you think about it, there is very little gadgetry, if any, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But there is one gadget that was scripted by Maybaum, Richard Maybaum, marvellous writer. And that was the opening of the safe in Gumbold's office, you know, when he finds the documents and the papers about Blofeld. And I felt that whilst I wanted to make that piece of gadgetry part of the film, I didn't want it to interfere with the relationship of the film. I didn't want, in fact, for it to suddenly slip into what we'd had before, where everything, the gadgets had become almost separate from the storyline. So I wanted to make it part of the storyline. And that was why I think there was a certain amount of invention on my part, which had to be because of the location. And we were incredibly lucky finding the location in Switzerland, you know, with the building being built and the crane taking the thing across. I wanted to make something out of that was not going to interfere with Bond being a real person. And that is why, during the sequence, when I was doing it, he does it all casually. He draws a chair up and he thinks, and we have this machine which he puts on, which is quite funny, and we managed to make the audience amused. But then I had to make him human, so he picks up a copy of, which is incidentally hidden in Mr. Gumbold's office, who is a very dapper, neat little Zurich gnome, let's say, unlikely to find a copy of Playboy in his private sort of file or in his private books with the newspapers about Wall Street and money and what have you. So I just had him pick that up, and if you notice, it was hidden in between a newspaper, which he opens and then takes out the fly sheet and all that sort of thing. And that was really how I think that came about. And I think it also, as I say, it gets a nice laugh. It gets a warm sort of reaction, which is what I wanted to keep up. And then the thing works and we go forward with that without ever having to interfere with it. So I had a piece of gadgetry with an emotional reaction to it that was warm and pleasant and moved our film along. It didn't suddenly stop in order to show a piece of gadgetry. And I think Playboy was a part of that, and a part of being very human. And that was one of the reasons why I did that.
Great.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful link. Yeah, wonderful link. Right.
5 minutes to take.
5 minutes to take.
For this answer. And then
5 minutes? Okay,
yeah,
I'll try
then we
and
change tape.
do it in that, and we'll see. Yes, the other thing that I indeed was very keen on from the book, the story of the book, was the skiing and the snow material that was there already in the story, which we enhanced, of course, a great deal, or at least Maybaum did, by making a script very exciting and very good. And the idea of going to Switzerland and shooting there was terrific, I thought. And we went the year before in order to find the right locations, and we had a lot of trouble finding, of course, Piz Gloria, and nobody ever questions it because what we finally did and got was fantastic. But at the time, a year before, when we were looking for it, and we were looking for this enormous place that could be a clinic on the top of a mountain with some sort of privacy to it, was practically non-existent. All the places that we were advised to go to were not there. And getting a little despondent, and we found railways and the other pieces of the film that we wanted to do. And getting a bit despondent I was about finding something that was really going to work there. Sitting in a bar in St. Moritz one night, that sounds all good, doesn't it? My German production manager came over to me and said, I've just been talking to a gentleman up there who says they're building a new skiing resort and cable car structure outside Mürren on the Schilthornberg. So I said, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that it's something like we're looking for? Well, he said, I'm not sure, but if I go and have a look, I can telephone you from there, and knowing what you're really looking for, I'll tell you whether there's any, any possibility. Because it was about a few hours journey away, and the next day we were going to look at some other location. So without interfering with our schedule, as it were, he went off and to Mirren and looked at this so-called new structure and cable car that was going to be put up. Well, he rang, the long and short of it is, he rang me and he simply said, I think you better just come. He said, this is what you've been looking for. And when I got there, I mean, they hadn't finished it. They were still building that structure on the top of the Schilturnbahn. In fact, we helped them finish it. We've from a finance point of view and from a design point of view, I think, our art director. And they hadn't yet got the big cables up to bring the cable car up. But by the time the year, well, next year that we were going to shoot it, it was all done. And it was all done to the necessary adjustments, specifications that we wanted for the film. And that was why it fitted absolutely perfectly. It looked like we probably built it. We could never have afforded to build such a thing. It's fantastic. And exists today. And exists today, of course, as a big tourist trap and great 007 restaurant and what have you. But what I was trying to lead to was that when we came to shoot there, we had the mildest winter for 40 years. And we had a terrible time trying to get snow. Snow melted on us all the time, and we used to have to bring cartloads of snow down from the Alps and spread it around the lower ground wherever we were actually shooting. So it became quite a problem, that sort of effort. When we came to do the Avalanche, of course, during that year before, when we were sorting out locations, we had the advice from the Swiss Army, who pointed out that near Mürren, the area that every year they had to blow because the snow always built up into an avalanche. And so we picked places, 4 cameras, 4 places I think they were picked anyway, for this avalanche sequence that I was very keen to shoot. And sure enough, in the winter when we got out there to do our shooting and the schedule, there was all the snow hanging up there on the peaks, and it was lovely. And they said, well, we've got the explosions into all the points you wanted, and the snow has fallen on top of them. And when we tell you, we'll know when it's ready to go, then you'll have to schedule a day to shoot it. I'm like, fine, great. Every day I used to come out of my little chalet which I was renting and to go shooting, and I used to look up and I could see this whole avalanche. And I used to go in the production office and say, should we shoot the avalanche yet? And they'd say, no, the Swiss Army will tell us when we're ready. Okay, I was fine, and go and get on with the work of the rest of it. And then, sure enough, as you've probably guessed, I came out one morning and looked up, no avalanche, nothing there. It had all gone in the night. Oh my God, now what do we do? I think Cubby Broccoli said, never mind, we'll put something else in. We don't need an avalanche. And I was so angry and said, no, we do, we've got to have an avalanche. And anyway, we went on shooting, and we didn't, I kept saying, maybe I can find some library material of an avalanche. So I got the cutting rooms into going around trying to look at library material and find anything there was on an avalanche. The only thing we could find, in fact, which is finally in the film, is a shot from the Disney library of an avalanche starting and coming down. And we, in fact, eventually bought this piece of film from them. And the entire avalanche, you ask about where the camera setups were, the entire avalanche was made up from this library piece of material, which was very good, but it was still not something that I shot, or that was shot specially for that sequence, and inserts, close-ups. I had the actors, I had Diana Rigg rolling around in phony snow, and George rolling around in phony, and bushes coming down and all that sort, which eventually we shot way back, later on, way into the insert stage of the studio. And I personally cut it all together, and with the help of Cliff Cully, who was the special effects man at Pinewood, he even put in some of the long shot of the library material my 2 characters, Diana Rigg and George skiing down there. He managed to, don't ask me how, he managed to paint them in size. And if you look at the screen, you'll see them coming down. I'm sure you have. And you'll see them coming down. But in fact, they were put into that film after I'd got it from the library. And I was so determined that to make that avalanche work that really, not a question of where you put the cameras, it was a question of editing it. And it was edited, and then I, again, went mad with the sound effects. I did the sound effects, and once I'd done that, and it really did work, it really made everything look tremendously real and good, which was the secret of filmmaking. We got to the Odeon Cinema for our first rehearsal of the film, and I realized it would be great in stereo, just for that piece. And that piece came right at the beginning of a reel, and I was able to arrange for the premiere night for it to be in stereo, just for that piece. They were all involved in the avalanche. I made sure the audience were practically sitting inside the avalanche by doing that. It shows you what you can do if you really have great determination and cussedness. And knowledge. You've got to have some knowledge about what you do with the scissors and the bits of film and that very sort of thing. It's a lesson, really. If any budding film editor ought to look at it cut for cut, because they'd see what was done, what I did. Amazing, it really was. It was a great sequence too. And it didn't matter that it wasn't real, you see. People know that it was entertaining, and they know that they were caught up in it. And that's what filmmaking is all about. We shouldn't tell them how we do it. I notice nowadays they keep putting these films on. I don't like them. They keep putting these films on about how we did this and how we did that. I think all that should be kept secret. I don't think audiences really should know about it. It ruins the illusion of filmmaking. But films have progressed or degressed or whatever it is for so long, so much now that I'm not sure. Anyway.
Right. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You just cut.
Yeah.
Right.
What does that question just say? Give me the last part of that question.
The most important reason is that Bond has become a man known around the world.
Yes, well, Bond has become so famous around the world, I think, because, or Bond films have become so famous, really. It's also part of Bond, because he's become a character that everybody knows. Everybody's got an identity with in some case, or in some form or other, and so have all the characters around him. In the old days, Jack Warner had a group of actors and people under contract, and they were always in all the films. The Sidney Greenstreets, the Peter Lorres, that group of people, doesn't matter whether they were doing Casablanca or whatever it was, the audience knew what they were and who they were, and they always played the same type of person. And so they were identified with them immediately they came on the screen. They didn't have to waste any time trying to make it into a new character or a different character. They knew that sort of character because that was something they played every time. And in the Bond films, that's something that they have to do too. Having established the Bond era, as it were, having got beyond From Russia with Love and succeeded in doing 3, 4, 5, 6, audiences now are waiting for their stock characters to come on, for Q to come on, for M to arrive, or whatever it is. And the same with Bond himself. And I think the identity of these characters is what really has made these films very successful. Of course, they've still got to be very interesting. They've still got to be a story. They've still got to be adventurous. They've still got to have all the excitement that's necessary and be paced properly. But basically an audience is aware. They know what a Bond film, they know what they're expecting from a Bond film. That's, I think, the reason why he's become so popular around the world. And then, of course, in the original, although they've divorced themselves a little from it, in the original he was a man of incredible taste and distinction, and wore all the right clothes, and drank the right wines, and ate the right foods, and was, in those, we've all got a little bit of the snobbiness And I think that that appealed too enormously. I think it's got lost. It got lost after, the first 6 or 7. I think we began to lose that style of James Bond. But it didn't matter because the films were good stories, and by then it had all been established, and so had the rest of the characters.
Right. That's
Not
good.
bad.
That's good. Right. Can we? Yeah.
That's the way you do it.
And apart from, and I keep saying this, what a well-written story on Her Majesty's Secret Service was, I felt that the ending was such a climax, and it was the sort of climax that we had never done in a Bond film before. So I was extremely pleased about that ending. I got more pleased about the ending after I'd shot it, because I felt that it was an extremely good, well-acted scene, both by wonderful Diana Rigg and George. George was incredibly good in that. And at one time I had felt that maybe the film should have ended with them getting married. In fact, if you carefully, all you film buffs, if you carefully look at the film, you'll see as they drive away in the wedding, my camera is on a crane, and it comes right the way up over the flowers, and you see the car driving away. Well, in my mind, at the back of there was maybe that could become the end of the film. And then the next James Bond would start with them driving up on the hills and her getting shot as the prelude, as the beginning of whatever the story was going to be. But as it transpired, I saw that George wasn't going to be doing the next one, and things were very uncertain. I just kept my mouth shut, and I thought, no, we'll have a lovely, lovely, unusual ending. And it's good, and it's well acted, and I think it will make an extraordinary large impact on audiences. And I hope it did.